I'm here with Professor Craig Wilder from MIT, who's joining us today to talk about his new book, Ebony and Ivy.
You did it. Yeah.
Not ivory, it's ivy. I'd also like to say that this is our third book chat in a series that's been sponsored by the Center for the Common Good in conjunction with other departments, including Africana Studies, my department, where I am currently director. My name is Tess, Chakkalakal, and I teach here in Africana Studies and English. So welcome to everybody. Welcome to our online participants. Davidson College in particular, folks from Davidson College, and others are Bowdoin alums and members of the community. So we've already been talking quite a lot about Professor Wilder's book. He gave a wonderful lecture last night, which included a discussion that included someone who's pretty close to my work, Phyllis Wheatley, Samuel Occam, and the sordid history of New England, Northeastern colleges, and based a little bit on my own reading of the book before we open it up to general questions, is kind of why you wrote the book, what you hoped to achieve in writing the book. And this came up in the questions yesterday. It has broad implications, obviously. But one thing that struck me about the book, which I find very useful in my own teaching, is it helps us to remember that slavery wasn't just in the South. Mm-hmm. That the North, particularly the Northeast, is not just culpable, participating, and right now we're doing a lot of celebrations of the Civil War, right, the 150th anniversary. And when we do that, we like, in the Northeast, at Bowdoin College even, like to pat ourselves on the back for being on the right side of history. I wonder how your book messes with that a little bit, messes with being on the right side of history, on the right side of the moral dilemma of slavery.
I think in many ways the project starts not really with the aim of sort of, necessarily transforming that view, but it does, it does challenge that, because I think what we tend to do, especially universities and colleges, is we're very selective about our history. Mm-hmm. We claim our relationship to abolitionism and then forget a much deeper, longer relationship to slavery. Mm-hmm. And I think that's also, in fact, a habit in Northern history generally, mm-hmm, to write histories, regional histories, that tend to emphasize the sort of triumphant moments, mm-hmm, of the North, both economic and political, mm-hmm, and that erase and obscure, mm-hmm, these much more troubling relationships in the past. And so when I started the project, really, in many ways, I actually was trying to figure out for myself, mm-hmm, why it was I was coming across these really interesting events happening on college campuses, because as I said last night, my aim wasn't to write a history of higher ed or to enter into the field at all, mm-hmm, but my own work was taking me to college campuses, and I was seeing these sort of really quite striking events and personalities passing through, mm-hmm, college campuses, and it forced me to start thinking about campuses differently, colleges differently, mm-hmm, as real instruments, mm-hmm, of power and influence and social change themselves, mm-hmm, both positively and negatively, and then tracing that history through time.
And I've heard you also say in other interviews, for instance, that it's also empowering, particularly for Black folks, to know that we've been here since the beginning, I think is something that you've said. But given the fact that slavery was so instrumental to the founding, the proliferation of colleges, would you go so far as to suggest that without slavery, we wouldn't have our remarkable system of higher education that we have today?
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, yeah, that's the short answer. Yes. The history of the American college is the history of American slavery. From the very first college in the Americas, the autonomous university down in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, through the era of through the pre-Civil War period, American colleges had an intimate and close relationship to slavery and the slave trade, And it's in fact the emergence of an Atlantic economy organized around a trade in human beings and the trade in the products of enslaved people's labor that the American college is born. And you can see this over and over again. In the British colonies, the first college is Harvard in 1636. A war breaks out in New England that very next year, the Pequot War, which culminates in the Pequot Massacre, the English versus the Pequot Indians of southern Connecticut. In the aftermath of the massacre, hundreds of women and children are sold into slavery to Bermuda in the West Indies. And the ship that takes them is named the Desire. And it leaves from Marblehead, Massachusetts. And it returns in 1638 with various commodities, including enslaved black people. Harvard gets its first slave that year. It's a man named the Moore who likely comes on the Desire, although it's not clear that that's true. It's very likely true. The circumstantial evidence suggests it's true. And so within 2 years of its founding, the college gets its first slave. And there's not a college founded in the British colonies after Harvard that doesn't have that similar connection to slavery. At William and Mary, the college actually is a major slave owner from its founding in 1693. At Yale, the founders of Yale, ministers from Connecticut, several towns, come together, and as one historian of the university puts it, they're followed by their slaves to that organizing meeting.
So this raises another troubling question for me, and then we'll open it up to the crowd here. We know how your story changes our perception of American colleges. How does your story change our perception of slavery as an institution as well, given its importance to our lives today, that without it, if indeed you're right, that without it, we wouldn't be sitting here today having this conversation?
I think it's exactly that. It's that we have to start to understand that slavery is the central part of the story of early American history. That everything else sort of, is understood by centering the narrative on slavery. You begin to understand the other things that happen, including the institutions that emerge in the 17th and 18th century, very often institutions that we cherish. And to come back to the earlier part of your question, one of the things that does, which is often, I think, unsettling for a lot of us, is it places black people at the earliest moments of American history. And that's always a difficult thing in United States society, because in fact that's the opposite of what we've been taught over years and years and years. And so to suggest that actually you can't understand American history without understanding the history of slavery is to suggest that in fact the avenue to having a sort of three-dimensional understanding of our past requires an engagement with a history that we've always resisted, evaded, and in fact run away from at great speed.
So with that, I would welcome questions from the audience, from those on email, online, who are with us now.
I have a question that just came in out of email, and it asks about for you to talk a little more about the role curriculum played in the sort of legitimization of slavery in the early colonial colleges. So more than just the fact that they had slaves, but that they justified it. And the second part of the question is, why did they do this? Was it for to legitimize the fact that there were slaves on campus, or for funders? What was the purpose of it?
You can see the influence of slavery on the curriculum from really the very early period of the American college, but it really begins to accelerate in the 18th century. We were talking earlier about the history of medicine in the colonies. And this is probably, I think, one of the sites where one can most vividly see the way in which slavery shaped the intellectual culture of the United States and the British colonies. The production of knowledge, the very production of knowledge actually gets shaped by it. And so I'll just give a few examples. At the University of Pennsylvania, which was then the College of Philadelphia, which is the first medical college in the British colonies, the young men who begin the college graduate from the Philadelphia College and from the College of New Jersey, now Princeton, and then they head to Scotland and they study medicine in Edinburgh, one of the great centers for 18th century medical training. And they're in a competition. You can actually see it in their letters back to their parents. They're in a competition with the New Yorkers to establish the first medical program back in the British colonies. The Philadelphians win by several years, which causes the New Yorkers some distress, but that's fine. And what happens is in order for the medical college to get established, one has to actually have access to human material, to human beings to practice upon. And so the medical college in Philadelphia actually begins when the colony transfers to the medical faculty the body of a black person. And in fact, actually, medical education in the 18th century America begins with the systematic use of enslaved black people as the research material for science. One can see this in, for instance, Harvard appeals to the Massachusetts General Assembly, General Court, for bodies of criminals and Negroes to practice upon and to give their undergraduates some scientific and medical training. At Dartmouth, the founder of Dartmouth, the Reverend Eleazar Wheelock, his personal physician actually takes the body of the corpse of an enslaved black man named Cato and drags it behind his house and boils it. He removes the skin of the man and then boils the corpse in a large kettle to separate the flesh from the bone. He wires the bone into a skeleton for instructional purposes, and then he takes the skin of the man to the tanner who serves the college and has it tanned like leather, which he uses to dress his instrument case. In the Harvard Museum, which is inside the original Harvard Hall, which burns, I believe, in 1763, in the list of things lost in the fire is I think this is a quote, the tanned hide of a Negro, a tanned Negro's hide, the skin of a black person tanned for instructional purposes. And over again, you see, in fact, in the 18th century, the rise of medicine actually emerges using the material of, or the bodies of enslaved and conquered people, Native Americans and Africans, and occasionally the Irish in the Americas, often the Irish in Europe, and occasionally the Irish in the Americas. The other way that you see it is actually, once that connection is made, once colleges come to, and they do come to depend heavily upon the slave trade and slavery for the sources of their finances, in severe and subtle ways, what gets taught at college, it gets transformed. You can see that happening really aggressively by the 1830s. You know, Charles Follen, the German instructor at Harvard, is basically dismissed from the college over his abolitionist opinions. And Follen is then sort of, he ends up dying rather tragically in a fire aboard a ship he's returning to New England aboard a commercial ship. The ship catches fire because cotton is stored too closely to one of the vents. It catches fire, the whole ship catches fire, and he's one of the passengers who dies in the blaze. And so you have this extraordinary story of an abolitionist who's sort of persecuted by Harvard over his political opinions, dying in a ship that's heading back to free New England carrying the products of enslaved people. In the science curriculum and in the humanities curriculum, you could also see the emerging role that colleges play in shaping in racial thought. You know, I argue in the book that colleges don't invent race, they refine it, and they give it intellectual legitimacy. And there's a competition between theology and science in the late 18th century and the 19th century to become, in fact, to claim the superior position for justifying the social order and the body of ideas that support that social order, particularly the body of racial ideas that support it.
Questions?
This does seem to throw the whole concept of education as a business on its head. The question of what is the cost of education? I mean, the way we ask that question is sort of dollars and cents now, but these costs of education in human bodies, and it makes me wonder whether or not it's worth it. I mean, whether or not there isn't a case to be made that these institutions of higher learning are perhaps, based upon your arguments here, just to be provocative, doing more harm than good.
You know, I think that universities do the work we assign them.
So we have control
And
over it.
right, and when, you know, when the dominant society assigns universities the work of defending injustices, that's the work that universities do. And when we assign universities the better projects of human affairs, that's the work but I think we have to take responsibility. And ultimately, the story of the American college is really a story about the rise of the United States and the nature of the British colonies themselves, you know. And so it's not, when you go through that material, and at the end, I understand what you're saying, but you know, when I looked at, for instance, Columbia, where I went to school, my sense wasn't that Columbia did this. It was actually that, you know, the founding generation of Columbia was largely slave traders, slave owners, and people heavily involved in the slave economies of the Americas, who had multiple projects that they were engaged in, including, in fact, establishing and bolstering Anglican governance in New York. It's originally established as an Anglican school, and all sorts of other things. You know, and so I actually, you know, it's not, I don't want to only see the institution acting there, because beneath the institution are the real interest of populations of people who, in the book, I want to name. I want them to have names and faces so that we think of them a little bit differently. And not so much that we reject them, but that we have to understand that founding generation in all of its complexity.
It goes with another question that was emailed in. So were the early college leaders just men of their time in terms of their social class, in terms of owning slaves, or was their involvement with slavery different from other people like them?
I generally avoid the men of their time arguments, that, you know, slavery was in the environment, and they were just part of their environment, because there are real choices that are being made during that period. And so, for example, I had mentioned that between 1745 and 1769, a 24-year period, the number of colleges in the British colonies more than triples to 10, right? So we go from Harvard in Massachusetts, William and Mary in Virginia, and Yale in Connecticut, to adding 7 new colleges, beginning with Codrington College in Barbados and ending with Dartmouth College up in New Hampshire, but including, in fact, virtually all of the Ivy League institutions today, plus Rutgers, and then minus Cornell, which is founded during the Civil War, if you can follow what I just said, that little puzzle. But the reason that that's important is that those institutions are founded in a kind of combination, right? The colonies are largely denominational, and it's a combination of ministers and merchants who helped to bring those colleges into being. That 25-year period, that quarter century, is also the moment when the slave trade peaks in the Atlantic world. And we're marshaling the resources of the trade, the wealth that's being created and held by specific families on both sides of the Atlantic, but on this side of the Atlantic to help to articulate the institutional infrastructure of the American colonies, and helping the various denominations really lay claim to their colonies, to really, in fact, establish themselves. And so the college, like the public library, like the public hospitals that are being established in the 18th century, those institutions are all, in fact, to some extent, benefiting from the rise of slavery and the slave trade. It's, in fact, the same groups of families that are establishing them. And so I don't like the argument that they're just men of their time, because it often suggests that the opposite moral argument isn't there. And in fact, the moral argument against slavery is being made at the very moment when we're going through that revolutionary period of higher education's advancement in the colonial world. The peak of college building is the peak of the slave trade, but it's also, in fact, the rise of the abolitionist movement. And so we have access to an argument against slavery. We have access to an argument against the Atlantic slave trade, and there are real choices being made in that moment. And in fact, actually, colleges are one of the institutions that will help us make those choices and ultimately help to swing the balance of political and moral authority toward defending slavery.
And is that, sorry, where there's, and is that defense then based also upon the practical need to fund these very expensive institutions, that the simultaneity of abolition with the peak of the colleges, I mean, these institutions require an enormous amount of money to work. We know this from debates going on our campus right now. Where does that money come from? It's got to come from somewhere. It's not going to be coming from, I don't know, whatever NGO or that kind of money. If we want to keep educating our students, we need that money. So,
Well,
I mean, I can
let me just say, the colonial and early national college campus is a much cruder environment than the 21st century elite college campus. Those colleges, two centuries.
They've got walls and chairs and
They've
big
got
books.
walls
I mean,
and chairs
that
and
stuff is
fireplaces.
expensive.
Yeah, and fireplaces, and but they also have farms. They actually produce a lot of what they consume, which is one of the reasons why many of them turn to enslaved labor, unfree labor, on campus, and begin to have significant numbers of enslaved people on campus. Faculty will have enslaved people, and so I don't think the primary driving force is the cost of college building. I think it's the opposite. It's the rise, it's the production of wealth in the Atlantic world that allows the college to come into being. Or in other words, it's not that the colleges are established and they need money. It's actually that the money is created that allows the American colonies to begin to articulate their internal institutional infrastructures. The very infrastructure that will help to carry us toward the Revolutionary War and to help the United States become victorious in that war. A lot of that colonial growth happens in the decades just before the war.
Right. Now, you said earlier that this is a story that's particular to the Americas, to the founding of the United States of America, suggesting then in other nations, their colleges, I'm thinking obviously of Oxford and of Cambridge and of the University of Glasgow and what St. Andrews, were they immune from?
No, not at all.
Right.
Because this is the Atlantic economy, and the Atlantic economy is actually shaping higher education on both sides of the Atlantic. Throughout the Atlantic world.
So then it's not just
and
an
so,
American
for instance,
story.
No,
So
no,
it's
no,
not just
absolutely, it's
American.
much bigger. Codrington College, established 1745 roughly in Barbados. When Codrington is established, General Christopher Codrington actually in his will, roughly 1711, 1712, leaves plantations in the West Indies to support a college in Barbados. It takes the planters more than 30 years to finally establish that college. But he also leaves part of his fortune to his alma mater, to Oxford. And in fact, actually, the slave traders of England, of Britain, are donating, in fact, large sums of money to British universities. New professorships are being established. And a lot of that money is actually coming from the British West Indies, both the plantations and the slave trade. And so this story is, in fact, an Atlantic story.
Okay. Right. Professor Purnell.
Thanks again for coming, Craig. When the transatlantic slave trade closes in 1807 or 1808, when after that interim period from 1787 until the time that the United States abolishes the transatlantic slave, after that happens, and we see enslaved labor grow with the eastern seaboard of the country westward, how does the internal slave trade and the expansion of the cotton economy into, at the time, what was the Southwest in eastern Texas or Mississippi, how does that political economy shape changes in American higher education during that next period?
And there are multiple ways of sort of following that, and I do some of them in the book. One of United States involvement in the slave trade ends, at least as a legal matter, in 1808. The sort of political and social reality of the slave trade will linger for much longer than that. But what happens is the American college actually follows westward expansion. And westward expansion, I note in the first chapter of the book that the American college has its origins really in two things, right? The money for the establishment of higher education and for sustaining it actually comes largely from the slave trade and slavery, disproportionately from those. But the territory, the land, and the population, the growth of population that allows for us to sort of maintain colleges will come from, in fact, systematic violence on the frontier. And so two things are sort of intimately tied, just like that Harvard story of, the colleges chartered in 1636, the war with the Pequot breaks out in 1637, the first slave arrives in 1638, right? The first enslaved black person arrives in 1638. There's, in fact, an intimate connection between the conquest of native people and the enslavement of Africans and the braiding of those stories together in ways that are actually quite complicated throughout that period. By the 1808, with the end of the slave trade, what happens is we begin the westward march of plantation culture, particularly cotton production, through the Southwest, right, through the new states of Alabama, Mississippi, into Louisiana, and ultimately into eastern Texas. And the American college marches westward with slavery. And so we begin to actually establish new colleges in these new settlements. I note in the book that Princeton, then the College of New Jersey, a Presbyterian institution when it's established, establishes more colleges than any other, the Presbyterians, establish more colleges than any other denomination in the United States, although in fact the Presbyterians are the third largest denomination and significantly smaller than the Methodists and the Baptists. Right? And a lot of that expansion follows, in fact, the diaspora of Scottish Presbyterians in the Americas into places like Kentucky and Tennessee and then westward. The first college west of the Mississippi River will be St. Louis University, established by the Jesuits. And it's Jesuits who are passing through, whose academic and institutional training will largely take place at Georgetown, and then who then move westward. They're largely Belgian and French Jesuits who will actually move westward and help to establish the Catholic Church in the Midwest. And the first university west of the Mississippi River, St. Louis, will be one product of that. They will own slaves and plantations. They'll also run Indian missions because that connection between the evangelization of Native Americans and the enslavement of African Americans continues throughout that period. And so the story is a story of following the march of slavery, tells you, in fact, the direction that the economies of colleges follow. For the old colleges of New England and the North and the Mid-Atlantic, what they begin to do is they actually look for new sources of students and funds in these emerging centers of economic and political power. In Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, become new sites for actually recruiting students and seeking out donors. So there's a vivid competition for that wealth. Yeah.
This was just emailed in, and it somewhat follows up from what you were just talking about. We're wondering about schools like Oberlin College that, at least in their own historical memories, have anti-slavery as a founding principle. How might these fit into your narrative or not?
They do fit in. I actually, in the final chapters of the book, really attempt to look at abolitionism on campus and what happens to the abolitionist movements on campus. There are lots of student abolitionist societies that are established in the 1820s and 1830s, particularly in the 1830s. There's also significant violence on campus in attempts to silence abolitionism and stop the spread of abolitionism. Faculties take votes to disband student abolitionist associations. I point out in the book that probably about 2/3 or 3/4 of the colleges in the North, in the Northeast, are aligned with the American Colonization Society, which is founded in 1817 with the aim of removing free black people to some site outside the United States. And by the 1830s, the Colonization Society is increasingly, it's quite aggressive in its anti-black and anti-abolitionist rhetoric. And that's the very moment when the influence of academics on the association is actually peaking. And so, for instance, by the mid-1830s, the president of the Colonization Society is the former president of the United States, James Madison. And his vice president is Jeremiah Day, the Reverend Jeremiah Day, who's president of Yale University. And there's tremendous academic influence on the colonization movement because it begins to borrow upon, or what the academics bring to colonization is an argument about a racial vision of the United States as a racially and religiously cleansed society, as a potentially racially homogenous society, using, in fact, the emerging science of race to craft a vision of the future, as one historian put it, an all-white vision of the future. Right?
And that's once academics.
And it's
But their
what the
imprimatur-
academics bring to that conversation. The academics bring, in fact, the language and the emerging body of knowledge that is circulating throughout the Atlantic world on race, racial capacity, and the role of race in emerging democracy, and a vision of the role of race in the emerging Republican democracy.
Makes you want to be suspicious of academics in general.
Yeah.
Professor Doran?
I had a question that pushes past your book's chronology a bit, but immediately following this, the Civil War, a new kind of higher education institution emerges. Samuel Armstrong is the founder of Hampton Institute, where emancipated people and Native Americans will be educated together. One of Armstrong's most celebrated graduates is Booker T. Washington, who goes on to found Tuskegee. Do you see any links or relationships between the early patterns, as you describe them in the book, in higher education, and how deeply slavery was embedded in those institutions, and this later set of developments following the Civil War?
Okay. Let me just say, I think it's connected actually to the story of abolitionism, right? Because the Oberlin story is in fact a fascinating story. But one of the reasons why the attention of the abolitionists shifts toward the Midwest is the anti-abolitionist violence in the Northeast, in New England and the Mid-Atlantic. Remember, there are several attempts to actually establish abolitionist schools in New England and the Mid-Atlantic, and they end in violence. The most famous of them, obviously, are what would have been the first black college in the United States, which was supposed to be established in New Haven in 1831. And it's the white abolitionist Arthur Tappan who donates the money for it. The Tappan brothers are both, Arthur and Lewis Tappan are involved. And it's a group of white abolitionists, mostly from New England, and black abolitionists from New York City, who combine with the goal of establishing this school. William Lloyd Garrison picks up the project, the editor of the Liberator. The land for the school is actually purchased. Garrison visits that spot and writes about it in the Liberator. He declares it to be the most beautiful spot in New Haven, a perfect place for a college. They at least claim to have gotten the sort of tacit support of Yale. But as I and other historians have noted, in fact, there's a conspiracy of the Yale alumni to stop the school from opening. And for multiple reasons. One was that I think there was a deep fear of competing with this new abolitionist project for funds. At the time, Yale's entire endowment delivered very little money, probably about $2,000 a year in actual income. And Yale's largest living donor was actually Arthur Tappan. So there were lots of reasons to oppose that project, and a conspiracy of Yale alumni who include the mayor of New Haven, most of the congressional delegation, actually turn against the school and declare it, they use the N-word, the N college, as a threat to New Haven and a threat to the prosperity of Yale and existing institutions. They also call it a threat to the sexual purity of the people of New Haven, and they cast black students as a potential, as predatory threat to the civilization of the state. That template for opposing abolitionist projects, and particularly abolitionist higher education, gets picked up in subsequent campaigns against people like Prudence Crandall, the white woman abolitionist in Canterbury, Connecticut, who opens her school to black girls and then is basically attacked by her neighbors. She's put on trial for educating black girls from outside the state, and actually convicted in her second trial. Her house is destroyed by a mob. And then the third of those campaigns is the one that I point to is Noyes Academy up in Canaan, New Hampshire, which opens as an abolitionist school open to both genders and all races without racial restriction. And in August 1835, a mob of 300 people surround the school. They dress the building in ropes and chains, and over the next 2 days, they rotate teams of oxen and men and drag the entire structure through town to the rear lot of a Baptist church, where they attempt to set fire to it and further destroy the building. They then fire cannons at the houses of abolitionists who had dared to board black students. And so one of the reasons why, in fact, Ohio and Western Pennsylvania and Ohio become the sort of focus for establishing an abolitionist institution was this sort of these rabidly violent campaigns that had taken place in the Northeast that forced abolitionists to start shopping for alternatives. Those campaigns also fracture the what we might call the sort of cooperation between black and white abolitionists on the education project. And it's not that they abandon each other, but what actually happens is I think the campaign to give black people access to higher education becomes a campaign that largely after 1835, that final attack, resides in the national Negro conventions. The conventions of free black people continue that debate, but you don't see, in fact, a lot of that conversation, as much of it among white abolitionists anymore. When Oberlin is established, it's an important site for institutionalizing abolitionism. But in fact, there are very few black students. And so, for instance, John Brown's father is a trustee. And John Brown actually, gets his sort of vision of the raid on Harper's Ferry because of that relationship. Brown's father is actually a trustee of Oberlin. He becomes a trustee because Western Reserve University, where he had been a trustee, refuses to accept a black student, and he resigns in protest. He goes to Oberlin, and then one of the things he does is John Brown actually gets hired to survey land that Arthur Tappan had given to support Oberlin. The land is in West Virginia and Pennsylvania, the Tappan Grant, and that's what actually takes him in that survey to Harper's Ferry, which is the first time he encounters that spot. And so that's the beginning of radical John Brown, who we know today, or that part of that expression of his radicalism. And I'm sorry, I never answered the last part of your question about post-1865, but I'll come back to it, I promise.
Other questions? Go ahead, in the back.
Thank you. Thank you for coming to speak with us. I'm Justin J. Pearson, and I'm wondering, what do you hope comes from the knowledge that your book provides? So you give a lot of information and a lot for us to digest, but what is your hope for us after we learn about the colleges, the universities, the impact that slaves have had on the American story and throughout the rest of the world on what we now know as the academy? Thank you.
I'm not sure, honestly. I think historians tend to get wrapped up with history, and history as its own good. And I think that there's a justification for that, which is that, our job is to inform people. I want us to have difficult social discussions and political discussions. I want us to have difficult, painful discussions about affirmative action. I want us to have conversations about the proper role, the social role, and the public role of colleges and universities. I want us to have conversations about the support of public universities. And the challenges that higher education is now experiencing. I want us to have difficult conversations about access and equality and all of those questions, but all of those actually begin with information. Right? They begin, in fact, with everyone being equally armed with facts and figures, and so part of the job of a historian is actually just to provide that. I also, as a person, believe in social justice and committed to a sense of social justice in which I think universities can play a significant role. And so my hope is that, there's that problem of truth and reconciliation. And in the United States, we often want to jump to the reconciliation part without wrestling with the more difficult part, which is the truth-telling part. It's the job of historians to bring us back to the truth-telling part. And so that's my major goal, is actually really largely to inform people and to get us thinking differently about this moment. Not because we get to score points on some side of an eternal fight, but because the way that we actually ultimately reconcile those tensions in America's history is actually by turning and honestly facing that past.
This is another question that was emailed in. How have colleges that you've written about responded to your book? Has there been pushback, or have you been denied access to things, or curious about what's been the reaction by the individual colleges?
No, I have not been denied access to anything on any college campus. I have gotten a glance every now and then, and especially after the book was published. Now I visit college archives, and they think I'm there. They worry about my presence in a way that they didn't, 4 years ago, 3 years ago. But I've never been denied access to anything. In fact, actually, the opposite is true. The college librarians and archivists have been extraordinarily generous with their time and their expertise as I was putting together the project. The universities themselves have actually largely responded positively. I gave talks on this topic even before the book was published, and then after at Princeton. I gave a couple of talks at Princeton. I gave a talk at Columbia. I've given talks at Brown, at the University of Pennsylvania, and multiple Catholic colleges. And my sense is that there's some I think the real tension in that question, if the person asking the question is interested in where's the resistance to this story, it doesn't show up really in resistance to me or to the book. It shows up as resistance to taking institutional responsibility for telling this story. Or in other words, Yale and Harvard, should not depend upon a professor at MIT to write their history. And it's that selective engagement with history that we began with. If we're going to claim the history of abolitionism, we have a moral obligation as honest intellectuals and institutions of higher education that pursue truth to also actually be honest about our past with slavery. And that's an institutional role, and so I think the institutions have to make that claim. Some have, or take up that work. Brown did it much before most of its peer institutions, but Columbia now has a course on Columbian slavery taught by Eric Foner, who won the Pulitzer Prize for the Lincoln biography just a couple of years ago. Princeton has a course on Princeton and slavery taught by Martha Sandweiss in their history department. And both are getting institutional support for those projects and involve, in fact, undergraduate and graduate students in those projects. And I'd like to see more institutions do that. There's nothing to fear in our archives. A college archive is basically just a diary of the college. And there are good things in there and there are bad things in there, but they're actually all about us. And so we might as well just turn and wrestle with that past. But I think the resistance is the resistance to taking institutional responsibility. And there I think you need undergraduates and the students and the alumni to really make that demand. Because it's really about, in fact, opening up our own diary and just being honest about ourselves.
It's as if, coming back to this question of the role of the historian is really in recording, truth-telling, telling us about our past. And it's getting people interested in the past as opposed to, in my view, this kind of hyper interest in the present. What are we doing now? We need to, it's all about the now. And maybe the future, what's going to happen in the future and all the doom that awaits us in the future. So how do you kind of get your students interested, especially since it's a sordid past, it is a past that isn't really one that we want to be proud of. How do you go about getting students into the archive, into special collections?
I think it's the same way that we get students into the Alumni Association after they graduate, right? It's taking...
Calling them all the time.
Yeah, right, calling them every day, relentlessly. But it's actually about taking ownership of your institution, right? And part of taking ownership and feeling ownership over your institution, really feeling a connection, is actually taking possession of its past and actually expressing your desire to shape the image of the institution. And I think part of the problem politically is that very often I imagine that some of the presidents and trustees think that to wrestle with the history of slavery on campus requires that you have this sort of confessional website page.
Right.
where every bad thing that ever happened shows up, right? And that's actually not what it's about. It's really about, looking at the names of the colleges and the buildings on campus, and dealing with the very difficult question of how do you actually publicly explain those names, and have some integrity about being honest about the sort of, the past that is invoked with those surnames that are sort of carved into buildings. And so, I think if we went through and took down the name of every slave trader on New England college campuses, very few buildings would have names left, first of all. But the other problem is that you would lose the opportunity to really talk about the slave trade in the Atlantic world. And so I think that, we're missing an opportunity to really make more three-dimensional our relationship to history. And by doing that, in fact, we're missing an opportunity to fulfill one of our central roles, which is educating people.
Right,
Why not begin with our campus?
right.
You have one more question from the audience, unless there's someone here who has a question. This question is, what's next for you? What's your next project?
Sleep. I'm scheduled right now to do to return to urban history, and to do a project on the long history of the ghetto, the long history of ghettoization. So that's the thing that has been sort of dominating my mind for a while, how to do that differently. So that's where my mind is. My typing hands haven't actually gone to that quite yet, but at least my mind is there. But my mind is usually a few years ahead of my body. But let me also just come back to this question of the post-Civil War period, because I didn't answer it. I think there is, in fact, a long lineage there, but one of the things that happens, and this is a kind of fascinating moment for it, beginning in the really 1830s and 1840s, we begin to get some advanced schools, as W.B. Du Bois used the term, right? It's the difference between a high school and a college in the 19th century isn't always that clear. And a lot of the historically black colleges emerge as sort of advanced academies, preparatory academies, and then mature into colleges later on, particularly right after the war. And so, but one of the things that happens is actually there's a turn toward education as a solution to the political crises of the United States in the Civil War period. And so the really quite difficult political and social question of how do you incorporate more than 4 million formerly enslaved people into the body politic is in part addressed by a new emphasis on the state, on the public responsibility to educate. But that's also resonant with, or coincident with, a new emphasis on education driven by concerns about immigration. And how does one incorporate large populations of immigrants in the pre-Civil War, post-Civil War period? And the answer to that, in part, becomes a new emphasis on the public responsibility to educate. And so education goes through, as you know, a kind of, there's a revolution in thought about the proper location for advancing education within the society, funding it, and even actually mandating it. And that conversation continues throughout that period. And so that's when a lot of our public high schools are established. And significant private support for for institutions that will educate the formerly enslaved immigrant populations, Native Americans. It's why at Hampton and a lot of, in fact, the early historically black colleges that have Indian schools on them, Native colleges on them, or Native schools on them. But also the other thing that's happening at that time and really crystallizing is a new sort of emphasis on plantation education. The education of sort of subordinate peoples becomes, in fact, an emerging science that's influencing a lot of these decisions about who can be educated together and what populations of people, what kinds of education are appropriate for what populations of people, which is also influenced by racial categories right, that bigger language of race in the academy. And much of that is actually being refined on some of the old historically old, now elite institutions.
Well, this project of education then is one that I think is close to all of us. And you've given us in this book and in your 2 talks with us over the course of these 2 days a lot to think about as educators, as students, and we thank you very much, Professor Wilder, for your time.
You're very welcome, and thank you for having me.